Oh, good grief, Sam! It's time to make our meme. Sam? Where are you? Sam? What's going on? Whoa! Oh, well, that'll do, I suppose. Right, hello everyone, it's the second video in the evolutionary ecology series. Now last time we had a bit of an overview on what the hell evolutionary ecology was, some standard theories, some standard definitions for us all to get a bit of a feel of everything, right? Today we're going to dive straight in, but before we do that we're going to talk about one final thing which is going to be cropping up quite a lot in this series, and this is this idea of there being an adaptive landscape. And this is a sort of conceptual idea which maps traits against their relative fitness compared to other traits. So here's a little diagram for you. So as I say, this is a conceptual idea where any particular trait will have different fitness peaks given different circumstances. Now, an individual could be anywhere on this adaptive landscape, but of course selection is going to be selecting for the fittest individuals. So over time, populations tend to climb these fitness peaks and reaching fitness peaks. But then you might wonder, once you get to a fitness peak, where do you go from there? Well, to go from one peak to a slightly higher peak on a different mountain, let's say, then different things could happen. You could fall back down again and then climb back up another fitness peak, but that's quite unlikely. What's more likely to happen is that could jump from one fitness peak to another, and what aids that is the evolution of a key innovation. Now this may all seem a bit pretentious, but as we'll see during the course of this video, actually when you look out in nature, these adaptive landscapes may actually exist. So just a brief little example then. We talked about how the evolution of flight in bats was a key innovation in their adaptive radiation last time, didn't we? Well, if we talk about the evolution of wings then, as bats evolved wings, they steadily went up this fitness peak on the adaptive landscape. But you've got to remember, I mean, it's an easy mistake to make, but as soon as wings evolved, that doesn't mean the evolution of flight happened at the same time. Okay? Wings didn't just suddenly appear. Okay? The wings gradually evolved until eventually they were big enough or they were able to be used for flight. Okay, so wing evolution allowed the bats to climb up those fitness peaks, but then when the evolution of flight evolved, that means that was a key innovation. That means they could jump to another fitness peak, and that is potentially what led to this incredible adaptive radiation that we see in the order Chiroptera. Basically, evolutionary ecology is all about thinking of individuals on this adaptive landscape wanting to climb up to those fitness peaks. Now what this video is about is adaptations in the wild, looking particularly at ecological traits. So the first thing we've got to consider is whether evolution is predictable. Right? Can it be predictable? Can you predict what's going to happen in the future? Well, it depends what we're looking at really. If we're thinking about things which evolve pretty quickly, such as bacteria, you can pretty much predict that things like antibiotic resistance in bacteria will evolve at some point. Okay? We talked about last time about Darwin's finches and how on Daphne Major that drought led to the evolution of increased beak size. Now, with our knowledge of evolution now, we could probably predict that over time beak size would increase in these Darwin's finches. But that doesn't mean that evolution is predictable, because the environmental changes which led to those increases in beak sizes certainly weren't predictable. This can be particularly the case in sexual selection. There's been a study on the lark bunting by Chain and Lyon in 2008, and they wanted to see what traits were being selected for in males by females in different breeding seasons. And it was shown that females' preferences to particular traits changed over time. Sometimes the females thought, ooh, he's got a nice beak, I'll mate with him because of that. Sometimes they were like, ooh, he's got a nice wing patch, I'll mate with him because of that, and so on. But why then? Why would a female's preference for a particular sexually selected trait change over the years? Well, that's because the environment is changing over the years, okay? And the environment, as we know, has a big effect on selection, okay? So it's the unpredictability of the environment that affects sexual selection as well as natural selection. And that really explains some big questions in biology. It explains why we have so much genetic diversity in nature. It all goes back to this thing called the Lek paradox. A lek is where usually birds aggregate. It's usually an open space where loads of male birds come up, usually in the morning, and really strut their stuff to try and impress females that are coming in. You get some really good ones of black grouse in this country. I've never been to a black grouse lek, but it's certainly on my bucket list. So basically the Lek paradox is all about why do we have so much genetic diversity if females are selecting for the same male traits each time? Surely over evolutionary time you'll end up with only the fit genes left in the population, if you like, because all the others are not selected for. So we can explain that partly because of the environment, which is constantly changing, so that means different aspects of males will be preferred depending on the environmental conditions. Now, when we're talking about artificial selection, then things do get a bit more consistent because we humans tend to select for the same traits year upon year. And this was studied in bighorn rams by Coultham et al. In 2003. And this is a species which is actively hunted. So here, the scientists looked at mean weight, mean horn length, and population size. Because remember, these rams are being killed basically for their horns. And between 1970 and 2001, around 51 individuals were shot. So this is helping to select out the gene which leads to increased horn size, right? And as a result of that, rams with large horn size tend to have larger bodies as well. So over time, the mean body size and mean horn length decreases over time. It doesn't have any effect on population. May I point out, the population actually increased in that time period. And it also doesn't mean that we're actually getting rid of the genes for increased horn size. Obviously, there's loads of genes that contribute towards something like horn size. Yeah? But what we're doing by shooting rams with larger horns is that we're reducing the frequency of those alleles, which is reducing the chance that they'll get back up to the allelic frequencies that they were at originally. Okay, well that's all very well, but without doubt one of the most influential studies in regards to adaptations in the wild in ecological traits was done by one of the great evolutionary biologists of our time, and that's John Endler. And him and his PhD student, I think, Resnick, did loads of work on guppies in Trinidad. And this was a study looking at how these guppies can change their life histories over time in response to different predators. Okay, so what they found, it was a natural observational study in Trinidad, below waterfalls, directly below the waterfalls, they were areas of really high predation pressure. Okay, in particular the pike cichlid. Okay, the pike cichlid is quite partial to a bit of guppy for lunch. Okay, whilst above the waterfalls there's slightly lower predation pressure. Individuals were collected and loads of different traits were noted. So reproductive allotment, embryo size, interbrood interval, size of males and females, all that sort of thing. And it was found that in high predation areas, males and females tend to be smaller and embryos tend to be smaller as a result, okay, of this high predation pressure. Okay, that's nice, but it doesn't tell us that much because it's only a correlational study. There's no experimental manipulation here, and that is what's needed really to really consolidate what we are apparently seeing. So to test for that, a translocation study was carried out, and it's almost as if the rivers of Trinidad were designed for this experiment to happen. It's so perfect because there's an area called the Damia River System in Trinidad, which, like areas like the Yarra River System, has places of high predation and low predation. But what's different about the Damia River System is that it doesn't have any guppies in it. Okay, so it's basically crying out for some scientists to say, right, let's shove some guppies in there and see what happens to them. And that's exactly what they did. Individuals from the high and low predation site in Yarra were introduced to the high and low predation site in Damia, and they were left for 8 years, which in guppy terms is around 30 generations, believe it or not. And then they came back after the 8 years and saw what happened. And what they found was, exactly like in our observational experiment, this was done by Gordon et al., by the way, what they found was, in high predation areas, individuals were smaller and embryo weight was smaller. But then, after more studies, after loads of mark and release recapture investigations, it was found that the individuals that did best were ones that came from the same predation environment. So basically, individuals from the high predation Yarra site did better in the high predation Damia site. Okay, and the same is true for individuals coming from the low predation Yarra site. Therefore, if conditions are ecologically different, individuals will suffer. So this is a perfect example of local adaptation. Even though these fish, remember, are all the same species, depending on the environment that they're in, these populations are locally adapted. Another great example of how predation can influence evolution in invertebrates this time is seen in this animal, Tamema cristinae, which is a walking stick insect, and this was studied by Nozzle and Crespi in 2006. Now this stick insect is particularly interesting because it has two what we call ecomorphs. Okay, yeah, there's two host plants that it likes to feed on. They're Adenostoma and Cenothus. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And these two host plants occur in the same place, they occur in sympatry, but the stick insects that live on the different host plants differ morphologically. This is mainly down to differences in body width and stripe colour. Okay, so what Nozzle and Crespi wants to find out whether these differences were due to influences by predators. Okay, so what they did, they took the two host plants, put the stick insects on these host plants, and then covered the plants with some netting or something so predators couldn't get at them. Okay, and they left them there for 24 hours or so and saw how they got on. Okay, then they did something else. In some cases, they removed the netting so predators could actually attack the stick insects if they wanted to. This was done in the wild, of course. And selection differentials were calculated just like how we talked about last time, and it was found that the selection differential was correlated with trait values only when predation was allowed to happen. Basically what I'm saying is that there's only a difference in survival of the ecomorphs on the different host plants if predators are put into the equation. Okay, if they're completely shielded off from predators, it doesn't matter which ecomorph is on what host plant. Okay, so The different morphologies here we're seeing in the two ecomorphs probably has something to do with reducing predator detection. It's for camouflage, basically. These predators are most likely going to be birds, and it's this which could be leading to speciation between these two ecomorphs. But speciation is a topic we'll be talking about in another video. Okay, so we've talked about how predation can affect the evolution of traits. Competition can as well. And this was studied in anolis lizards, which is another one of those fantastic adaptive radiations that we've been talking about. And that was studied by Karlsbeek and Cox in 2010. Once again, they found an environmental setup in nature which was perfect to conduct experiments on. Okay, so this was done in the Caribbean, which is where these anolis lizards have adaptively radiated. And they looked at islands where some had no predators, some had bird predators, and some had bird and snake predators. Okay, we know that birds and snakes do like anolis lizards for lunch. Okay, that was already known. What we're trying to see is whether this affects survivorship. And what we found was that yes, it does affect survivorship when you're comparing islands with either no predators or predators with birds with islands with both birds and snakes. Okay, so there was no difference in survivorship in islands where there were birds and ones where there weren't birds. Okay, snakes had to be present for there to be any difference at all, which is interesting. So how do you explain that? Well, what we find is when there's snakes on the island, we do see behavioural differences. Anolis lizards tend to climb up further in the forest canopy when there are snakes present. Okay, so that means we've got a problem here. We haven't really got a controlled study because the anolis lizards are behaving differently depending on the circumstances and depending whether snakes are present or not. But what was looked at, whether there was an effect on the density of anolis lizards introduced onto these different islands. And what was found was when individuals were introduced onto these islands in high densities, traits that affect body length, hind limb length and stamina were selected for. So basically, predation may not be having an effect here, but competition due to the density of individuals introduced onto the islands might certainly be having an effect. Okay. Now, another example comes from the Bahamas, which is a lovely place. These evolutionary ecologists like to travel to nice places, clearly. On these specific lakes in the Bahamas, there are specific endemic populations of pupfishers. And this was studied by Martin and no other than my namesake, Wainwright, in 2013. Right? And they looked at a particular species in which, like the Tamema stick insects, have ecomorphs. In this case, there are 3 ecomorphs. And these ecomorphs are divided depending on their diet preferences. So some are generalist, some are scale eating, and some are durophagous. And that means they like eating hard-shelled prey. Right? So some of these pupfish were taken and reared in the lab. And the different ecomorphs were hybridized together. And basically some simple Mendelian genetics was carried out. So there was hybridization event which created an F1 set of offspring. But that F1 set of offspring doesn't really tell you much. What you need to do then is hybridize the F1 offspring with each other to produce the F2 generation. And once you've got the F2 generation, then you've got a whole range of phenotypes to work with. And what these scientists were trying to do was basically recreate the adaptive landscape. Once you've got the F2 generation, you've got individuals with a real mixed jumble of different genes there. Okay, and that is what you can look at. So then what you do is you release this F2 generation back into the lakes in the Bahamas and see which ones survive and which ones don't. And what you find is that intermediates tend not to do as well. So it was found that the fittest individuals were the durophagous ones and ones which were generalists. Okay, so this is proof, as I was talking about earlier, that the adaptive landscape does actually seem to exist. parasites are crafty little devils, aren't they? So you might expect that they also have a big influence on selection. And they do. Now, we often think about the co-evolution between parasites and their hosts in terms of the Red Queen hypothesis, where individuals basically have to keep evolving to stay in the same place. And transplantation experiments have been done to look at this sort of thing in this mollusk called Potamopyrgus, I think that's how you pronounce it anyway, and they've been infected with a trematode parasite called Microphallus. Okay, and these parasites were introduced from different lakes. Yeah, this is a freshwater snail, so it lives in lakes. And these studies were conducted in New Zealand, and what they found is that if you introduce a parasite from a lake called Maporika Lake, and you introduce it to snails from Lake Maporika, then those parasites are more successful. So this suggests that parasites are locally adapted to infect the snails which they've co-evolved with. Yeah? So it's another example of local adaptation. That was shown by Lively in 1989, but 11 years later, Lively and his new mate Dibdal, great name, yeah, looked at this a little bit further and created hybrids. And what they found was that these hybrid trematodes don't do so well at infecting the snails. So in the previous study, we kind of hinted at the fact that these Microphallus trematodes were co-evolving with the snails so closely in that lake that they couldn't actually infect snails in other lakes as easily. And that's what this hybridization experiment really highlights. It's showing that specific genomic combinations are absolutely necessary for that parasite's success. Okay, so this all leads to a completely new concept called the suicide king. Okay, you are co-evolving with your host so closely that if you get put in another environment, you do terribly. Okay, so you can think of this as sort of an evolutionary treadmill, if you like, because the more and more you specialise, the worse and worse you become at surviving somewhere else. Okay, so the only way to avoid the suicide king is by dispersing. And this has particular consequences on other areas of science, such as conservation, as studied by Torchin et al. In 2013, where he found that parasites were less prevalent on introduced species. So that's why if you introduce a particular species into a new habitat, they do so well because they're freed from all their parasites, because there are no parasites available to infect them and reduce their numbers. So that's why things can sometimes get a bit problematic. And it takes a long time for parasites that are already in the introduced environment to infect these invasive species. Okay, so very interesting stuff. That's all I've got time for. Next time we'll be looking at something which I devoted the whole series to last time. We're going to be looking at sensory ecology, but from an evolutionary perspective. How very exciting. So I'll see you next time.